Started as more people may join. Welcome everyone. I'm Amy Gillette. I'm the Vice President of Education here at the William Davidson Institute at the University of Michigan. And as we get started, I'd like to give you just a little bit of background on WDI. Chris, if we could advance to the next. Yeah, so WDI is a nonprofit research and educational institute. We're based at the University of Michigan. And we're guided by our founding principle that thriving businesses drive economic development and improve social welfare in low and middle income countries. Next slide. There's a lot of ways you can engage with us, and we invite you to please do so. We have a monthly e-newsletter. You'll find details on our website here. You'll also find links to our social media. We have a very active presence on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. You'll find all those icons on that website, and please do follow us. By following us and joining our newsletter, you'll find out more about our Global Impact Speaker Series, in which we bring in great thought leaders such as today's speaker, Ambassador Osius, to speak about business and global challenges and development. As we get going here, just a little bit more background about Ambassador Ted Osius. I think you probably already dug in a little bit to his background, and he's written a new book called Nothing is Impossible. Ambassador Osius served in Vietnam from 2014 to 2017. While he was ambassador, he devised and implemented strategies to deepen economic security and cultural ties between the two countries, and he'll be talking a lot more about that this afternoon. Before he became ambassador, he also served as deputy chief of mission in Jakarta, Indonesia, and political minister counselor in New Delhi, India. And also a senior advisor on Asia and trade to Vice President Al Gore, among several other diplomatic roles. And upon leaving the government, he's had a very distinguished career, starting as Vice President for Government Affairs and Public Policy at Google Asia Pacific. And he's currently serving as President and CEO of the US-ASEAN Business Council. So today's talk will be divided into three parts. The first part, Ambassador Osius will share with us some highlights from his new book, Nothing is Impossible. And we do have, again, for those who missed it, we have a link to the book along with a discount code in the chat room right now. So I encourage you to check that out. In part two of our talk today, the ambassador will focus on his career and discuss some of the differences he's encountered in working for the government versus the private sector. And finally, in part three, the ambassador will share his experiences and observation on what it takes for people to succeed across cultures, with a focus on Southeast Asia and Vietnam in particular. So without further ado, welcome Ambassador Osius, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Amy, thank you so much for that very nice introduction and for the warm welcome. Thank you, Chris, for helping us out today. And thanks to the William Davidson Institute. It's an honor to be able to speak with you. And go blue. I told Amy and Chris earlier, my grandfather taught at the University of Michigan. My mom went there. She grew up in Ann Arbor. My dad went there. They met there. I feel great affinity. I had a chance to visit not long ago. Really, really, this is very meaningful to me to be able to talk to you, whether you're in Ann Arbor or affiliated with University of Michigan in any way. So I thought I would tell a story. My book is not a policy wonk book. It's a book of stories because, in my view, reconciliation is about people. And so I thought the best way to tell the story of the arc of reconciliation between Vietnam and the United States over the last 30 years was to tell stories about people. Basically, the men and women, Vietnamese, American, the heroes who took risks in order to bring about reconciliation, to take two former enemies and make them friends and partners. So the first story I wanted to tell is about a friendship, and it's a bipartisan friendship. And it started in the middle of the night in February 1991 on a US Air Force plane that was taking a congressional delegation to Kuwait to look at the results of Desert Storm. And just by happenstance, two senators were seated kind of knee to knee, one Democrat and one Republican. And these men didn't actually like each other. One was Senator John Kerry and one was Senator John McCain. And McCain had actually campaigned against Kerry when Kerry ran for Senate the first time. They had two very different views of the war in Vietnam. They both served. They were both veterans of Vietnam, but they had completely different perspectives. McCain, I think, actually went to his grave convinced that if we prosecuted the war differently, we would have won. And Kerry had concluded very early on that the war was a mistake and had been an activist speaking out after he returned as a decorated veteran. But back to 1991, they were stuck on this plane. It was an all-night flight, and they started a conversation when they were, just because they were seated next to each other. They started a conversation that evening that lasted for decades, and they began a friendship that lasted for decades because they started talking about their wartime experiences and about how to move on. And the two of them, from very different angles, had concluded that it was in America's interest to close the door on the past, or at least part of the past, and think about what kind of a future might be possible if there were a partnership between the United States and Vietnam. And so they decided to tackle what was the hardest issue at the time. This is the years of the Rambo films, and there was a whole mythology that had built up about prisoners of war held in tiger cages in Southeast Asia. And they decided to prove a negative, that there were not people being held against their will. There were not POWs being held against their will in Vietnam. And they went on to do this. They set up, after that trip, they set up a select committee on POW MIA affairs, and they created the conditions under which normalization of relations was possible. But I just want you to think for a moment about what it was like for these two men. John McCain was the son and the grandson of admirals. He was shot down in 1968 over Truc Bac Lake. And when he was ejected from his F-4, by the time he hit the ground, or hit the water, he already had two broken arms and a broken leg. And by the time people dragged him ashore, these people were not thinking about his well-being because he'd been bombing their city, he'd been killing their families. So by the time he came ashore, one of his bones was protruding through his leg, and someone had bayoneted him in the groin, and he was in rough shape. And he was dragged off to a place called Hoa Lo Prison. That's what the Vietnamese called it. The French referred to it in those terms. Hoa Lo meant fiery furnace, and Americans called it the Hanoi Hilton. And after some months being held in the Hanoi Hilton, McCain was in worse shape, actually, because his fellow prisoners kept him alive, but they didn't have any anesthetics. They didn't have any way of setting his bones properly. His wounds were not treated by a doctor. There weren't medicines. And he'd shrunk down to about 100 pounds. And he was dragged before the warden, who by then had figured out who his dad was, realized his father was the admiral who was in charge of the Pacific Fleet and was waging war against Vietnam. And they realized they had somebody valuable here, and this was a bargaining chip. And so the warden said, "You, McCain, you can go. You can go out of prison." And McCain had been brought up under the military code. The military code says basically first in, first out. If you don't go, you go in the order in which you went into prison. You don't go out of order. And so he went back and talked to his cellmate and said, they gave me this offer. This is a guy named Roy Connor, and they offered me the opportunity to go, and his friend said, John, you got to go. You're going to die if you stay in here. You're exempt from the military code. But McCain went back to the warden and said, no, I will not violate the code. I will not go until those who came into prison before me are released. And the warden said, you know, this is going to be really bad for you. You will be punished. And he was. He was thrown into solitary confinement for the next 2.5 years. And he, was tortured. But they re-broke the ribs that had healed. It was not easy for him, but he made that decision to stay. Now, why do I tell you this? When I went to become the 6th ambassador to Vietnam, I knew there was one person in the Senate whose vote I needed. If John McCain would support me as ambassador to Vietnam, I'd be confirmed. And so I went to see him, and in the middle of our discussion, he grabbed me by the arm and took me over to a wall where there was a framed telegram, and it was from Paris, and it had been written by the ambassador who was leading the Paris peace talks at the time. And there was one line that was highlighted. It said, Admiral McCain's son, who was being held in the Hanoi Hilton, was offered the chance to be released, and he said no. And at the time, I didn't really understand, why is he showing me this? Why is he reminding me of this history? And then it hit me, he's telling me who he is. He made a decision based on duty and based on what he believed was in the interest of his country. And in that flight in 1991, he made another decision based on something kind of old-fashioned, patriotism. He decided he would join hands with this Democrat and try to move the relationship forward, create a possibility where reconciliation was possible. So to me, it's a powerful story that someone would put his own interests, who would put his own interests second and put his country's interests first. And it was not politically popular to do what he did. He made a choice that meant that veterans threw tomatoes at him and eggs and called him a Manchurian candidate. And they protested him wherever he went, because they said, by normalizing relations with Vietnam, you're betraying us. Well, I would argue it's just the opposite. He and John Kerry took an unpopular political position because they knew it was in the interest of the United States to have a new relationship with this country, which is now 100 million people on the border with China, and a strategically important friend. And the next stories, the next 30 years, are all about how we took advantage of that moment that those two senators created to build a relationship with this faraway country with which we have such a painful and terrible history. And I think that's a story worth thinking about. How is it that reconciliation came about between two enemies? And the period in which it occurred, really 25, 30-year period, is pretty fast if you think about it, because we didn't win that war. And the wars that we won, it was easy for the United States to be magnanimous. It was hard for the United States to come to grips with our past in Vietnam, to turn the page and move on to a new relationship, but we did. People like McCain and Kerry and the first ambassador to Vietnam, another prisoner of war in the Hanoi Hilton, a man named Pete Peterson, were heroes in my view. And there were heroes on the Vietnamese side who took enormous risks in order to bring our two countries together. So I'm left with two thoughts. One is that relationships matter. And I'm telling you, in diplomacy, relationships matter. And the relationship between those two men turned out to be of great importance. And the other lesson I'm left with is that taking risks is necessary in diplomacy as in life, that there are times when you just have to take a risk, and they took a big risk to do what they did. And people on the Vietnamese side took big risks to do what they did, to bring our two countries together. And those are the stories I tell in this book. And I'm happy to talk with you about that, Amy, and then we can move to the other parts of the discussion.
That sounds perfect, Ambassador. So we are taking questions in the Q&A. Please ask your questions about Ambassador's term in Vietnam or anything related to what he just mentioned, this fascinating story. Okay. Oh, we have a question in the chat. Thank you, Jill. You said John McCain had an old-fashioned patriotism. In your opinion, is patriotism, love of country, out of date in the United States today?
So I think it maybe that's a hard question to answer. You all will remember that Donald Trump taunted John McCain and taunted the fact that he had been held as a prisoner of war. And in my view, that made no sense. This was a guy who had sacrificed himself for his country, had suffered terribly for his country, and he was being taunted by somebody who I did not view as patriotic. I saw as all about himself, his own self-interest and the interest of his family. So I think that these ideas of patriotism are being tested today. And I think caring about one's country, I'm proud to wear this flag. I think that's not a matter of party. There's at various times one party or the other has tried to say, well, we're the most patriotic. I don't think that's about party. I think it's about wanting to support ideals that are bigger than we are. This morning, President Zelensky spoke to the two houses of Congress, and he was in a way conveying sort of old-fashioned values. No, I don't want to ride out. I want support. I want your support so that this democracy can survive, because he's facing something terribly evil. And I think he's kind of reminding us that democracy comes at a cost. So I think these lessons of patriotism and what it is to serve your country and do right by your country and do right by your fellow citizens is a very pertinent question today.
Pertinent here, pertinent around the world too. Great, thank you. Okay, we have a question from Pavel. In light of what we're seeing in today's politics, self-righteousness and gaining the popular vote through grievances, how do you see the future of American politics and, in your axiom, doing the right thing?
Well, the story I tell is about Vietnam, but I actually think it's a bigger story. I think when you choose to do the right thing, it's liberating. What I have found in a long career as a diplomat is that sometimes you have to really take risks to do the right thing. I made the decision when I was ambassador to support the idea of bringing the General Secretary of the Communist Party to Washington, D.C. to meet President Barack Obama. And that was a risk. There were a lot of people who said, you don't bring a party leader, especially the leader of the Communist Party, to Washington, D.C. to see the President of the United States in the Oval Office. And I beg to differ. I thought, we don't need to win over those who are on our side. The point is to build trust, make friends, build partnership with those who don't agree with us. And so I thought it was actually very important to take that risk. It was probably the biggest risk I took in my career, and it paid off. It changed the trajectory of a relationship in a historic way. The stories I tell are stories of reconciliation. Are those relevant to the United States, where we're having a lot of trouble with reconciliation? I think so. I think the basic human stories that I tell are about how people tried to understand each other. People who came from different points of view tried to understand each other, tried to show respect to each other, tried to listen to each other. I think that's relevant. I think in my view, diplomacy is about relationships. There are those who think it's all about power and money, and I beg to differ. It's not just about power and money, it's about relationships. And if you can show respect to your opponent or someone who's on a different side from you and take the time to understand what that person is thinking, what that person's interests are, or that nation's interests are, then you have a chance at building friendship. Then you have a chance at building partnership, and that is beneficial. And so I thought these stories, even though they're about Vietnam, were worth telling to Americans today.
Absolutely. Great. And building on what you just said, we have a question from Pascal, who says, one of the key requirements for rapprochement to work seems to be the willingness of both parties to agree that there is a need and desire for it. But what if need and desire on the part of both parties is not yet there? What do we do in the meantime?
That's a great question. In the case of Vietnam, there was a great desire on both sides. The desire was there first on the Vietnamese side. And we finally realized that it was right for us to respond. And then in recent years, the desire on the part of the Vietnamese intensified because they were dealing with a very powerful neighbor to their north. They were dealing with incursions, not only on their northern border, but in the South China Sea. The Chinese had chosen a tactic, which is bullying, and the Vietnamese turned to us, and our job was to open our arms and return the embrace. It's a lot easier to build a partnership when both sides want it. When you're working on something that's much tougher, and in my case, it was human rights in Vietnam, then you also have to use leverage. It's not just nice words. It's not just warm sentiments. It's also leverage. And in the case of human rights, for a while, we had really powerful leverage in the form of a trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And we actually negotiated and signed the strongest deal, the most comprehensive deal on human rights that we ever had in our two nations' history. It was a side letter to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And then the United States withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And guess what? That was thrown out the window. We lost our leverage when we did that. And so when the two parties' interests don't exactly coincide, well, then you have to be smart and you have to figure out what are the interests on the other side? What leverage do I have? What can I do to bring about change? And my view, after being a diplomat for a very long time, is you can only bring out about that change if you engage, if you learn to do things together, even when it's hard. And I was asked earlier about the situation in Myanmar because I cover all of ASEAN in my current position. And I think it's the same. It's not that we like the junta, quite the opposite. It's that if we want to find a way to move the needle in a country where people are in great danger as a result of the actions of the military. In the case of the Burmese people, we got to have some leverage, but we also have to have some minds open. We have to not be afraid to engage. We're not saying that what they're doing is okay by talking to them and by engaging with them. Diplomacy is about finding where interests might coincide and then using leverage, using relationships to see how far you can go together.
Okay, great. We'll take one more question in this part that relates more to this part. We do have some questions, and I think you'll cover some of the content later about doing business, which are great questions, but they pertain to the last part of our talk. We have a question about what does U.S. reconciliation look like in Vietnam in terms of environmental degradation from the war's dioxin pollution, from Fong Hong.
Thank you very much. I spent a big chunk of my book talking about this. My view is that you can't deal with the past effectively if you're not honest about it. And we were, over time, honest about very significant parts of the legacy of war. First, we were honest about finding those whom we'd lost during the war. And over time, we began to be honest about how the Vietnamese side had suffered and those whom they had lost during the war, and the importance of returning their remains to their families and providing closure. after Bill Clinton was president, we started getting honest about the impact of unexploded ordnance in Vietnam. And I was with him when he announced we're going to start a program to clean up unexploded ordnance. And we've been doing it for more than 20 years, and it's been very, very, very effective. And then I inherited from my predecessors a situation where we had started to be honest about cleaning up Agent Orange. For years, US officials, including me, were not allowed to use the words Agent Orange or dioxin in public. It was a toxic word as well as a toxic substance. It was political third rail. And the third US ambassador to Vietnam, a guy named Michael Marine, seized that third rail, said, we must be honest about this. And over time, we were able to clean up the worst waste dumps when it came to dioxin, the ones that were still poisoning people, still poisoning Vietnamese, because people were still fishing out of the lakes that were soaked in dioxin, or eating the ducks that had eaten the fish out of those lakes. And I spent my entire time as ambassador trying to ensure that we clean up Bien Hoa, which was the worst dump for Agent Orange, and we're doing it finally. But it took too long, and we still haven't dealt with all the effects of Agent Orange. There's still people who are suffering from the results of being exposed to Agent Orange, whom we haven't helped. It's an unfinished story. But I can tell you, the only way you can deal effectively with a situation like that is to be honest. And my watchword when I was there, and I think that my predecessors and successors have followed the same approach, is you've got to be honest about the past. You got to deal with it, even if it hurts, even if it's expensive to deal with it.
Wow. Is that cleanup ongoing still, or is it?
It is.
Yeah. Okay.
It is. The good news is that there used to be people living near the Bien Hoa Air Base who were still being exposed through, if they were fishing or farming ducks, they were still absorbing dioxin. And once you absorb it, it's with you forever, and it's with your children and your children's children and your children's children's children. I mean, it's awful. And I saw this as a moral question first. We must do the right thing and clean this up. But I would also point out that it was if we wanted to have the kind of relationship we wanted with Vietnam, we had to be honest, because the Vietnamese kept saying to me, and I just was there last week, and I saw the defense official with whom I'd worked, if you don't deal with this, we can't have the kind of partnership that you want. And he and I had this discussion again just a few days ago. We made enormous progress. We're not quite done.
Wow, that's amazing. Great. I'd like to turn it over now to part 2 of our talk.
Yes.
And as we mentioned in the introduction, the ambassadors had a wonderful career, both in diplomacy for the State Department, but also in the private sector more recently. And would love to hear more about your view. Maybe there's students on the call today, kind of the differences that you've seen, kind of pros and cons, or what people should keep in mind when they're kind of looking at these 2 very different sectors.
Thank you, Amy. And you mentioned in your introduction that I served in a number of Southeast Asian countries. I've lived in 5 out of the 10 countries that make up the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And I've worked in Japan, Korea, I've worked on China, I served in India. So I spent my whole career in what now is referred to as the Indo-Pacific. I went into public service out of grad school, and I think I was pretty convinced that the only way you could make a really big difference was via public service. And what's happened is my views on that have changed over the years. When I left public service, I went first to a university. I was vice president of the first American-style university in Vietnam, Fulbright University. And then I was offered an opportunity to go to Google. And I remember thinking, private sector, wait a minute, how can I do any good in the private sector? But I'd seen by then what Google was able to do because it has resources and it's had a mission of bringing the world's information to everybody. And I realized actually I could use this experience that I have in Asia to do some good in the private sector. And now I'm president of the US-ASEAN Business Council. My job is to bring Southeast Asia and the United States closer together through private sector ties. And we have, as members, 176 of the biggest American companies. They're all doing business in Asia, and a lot of them are doing a lot of good. It isn't just about extraction. And what I constantly am explaining to folks, if you think it's only about extraction, you will fail. If you realize that the role of the private sector is to make people's lives better, not just to bring about prosperity, but to give people access to information or access to better healthcare or access to better nutrition. If you think about it that way, and I'm not even talking about just corporate social responsibility, I'm thinking core elements of the business model are about building capacity and building up communities and building prosperity, you can make a huge difference. One of the companies I worked with a lot when I was in the region was General Electric. Now it's gone through a lot of changes in recent years, but when I look back over the successes that GE had in Southeast Asia, it's because they invested in people. So when they would go to the government of Indonesia, for example, the Indonesians have been burned over hundreds of years by foreign companies that came in and viewed their job as extracting. You know, Dutch East Indies Company left the country with, I think, 200 people who had college degrees. They weren't at all interested in mission civilatrice. They were only interested in what they could take away. And so, of course, the Indonesians are cautious when they're dealing with multinational companies because they've been burned. But GE got that, and they spent their time educating young engineers, building communities, providing support to communities, educational support, and it was part of their business model. And their leaders were local as well as foreign, and I saw them do a heck of a lot of good. And I saw other companies over my career do enormous amount of good. So what has happened to me is that when I left public service, I think by then I was open to this idea that you can perform service in the private sector as well as a public servant.
Great. It just might feel a little different and present somewhat different challenges.
It does, and it does. And there are, plenty of reasons to criticize our big multinationals, but they're part of the story. So what I learned when I was still ambassador and before was that if you work with those companies and you think about their investments overseas and you think about what they're doing overseas and you can steer them a bit in the right direction, then you have a chance to make a big difference. When public servants and representatives of the private sector can get on the same wavelength about resolving problems, then you have a really powerful combination. And I was a political officer. So my first years as a diplomat, I didn't really understand that. But over time, I grew to see how that was possible. And one of the people who kind of taught me that was Eric Schmidt, when he would visit Indonesia or visit Vietnam for Google. And I think that's what opened me up to the possibility of working for the private sector. And I'm still doing it. Now I'm doing it, I sort of as a quasi-diplomat and as someone who brings the private sector together with partners in Southeast Asia. But I see us making a difference every day, and it's a life lesson.
That's great. Can you talk a little bit more about your role at Google, what you were responsible for and your experience there?
I mean, I came in as an ex-ambassador who'd lived all over the Indo-Pacific, and I had a network all over the Indo-Pacific, basically from India to Japan to New Zealand. And that was the area I covered. I had 30 countries in that triangle between India, Japan, and New Zealand. And I had a very dynamic, talented team, people working in each of those countries where Google had a presence. And I led them through the process of dealing with the governments that were grappling with this new technology and how to deal with it. And nobody really knows the answer about how to deal with the challenges of the internet. We're all figuring it out because these powerful new technologies are affecting our lives in every way, in good ways, like the fact that we're able to talk today, even though we're in different cities, and in terrible ways. And what was fascinating to me was that the debates at Google were not about profit. Well, Google makes a lot of money, and so we weren't talking about, well, how can we boost our quarterly profits and make our stockholders happy? No, from the CEO on down, we were constantly talking about what is the right thing to do, in this rapidly changing regulatory environment and these rapidly changing views about the internet. What can we do that will sustain democracy? What can we do, like in India, world's largest democracy? Can we help make sure that that election is fair and that voters have access to the best information? What can we do working with the Central Elections Commission in India? Repeat that story over and over again. How can we provide skills that will enable small and medium-sized businesses to get through COVID? Because people in Asia are going online at a remarkable rate, and that rate accelerated during the pandemic. And they're not then turning off their screens. They're staying online. They're engaged online as well as offline, and their businesses are online. But people lack the skills very often. So we had programs to bring skills to underserved communities throughout ASEAN and throughout the rest of the Indo-Pacific. And we were constantly thinking about what can we do to make society better. It really did boil down to that. What can we do to make the lives of individual people better? And what can we do to contribute to progress in society? And I know more dramatically did I see this in YouTube. YouTube was getting a really bad rap for the harmful things that were appearing on YouTube. And Susan Wojcicki, the CEO of YouTube, took this so seriously. This was core. She wanted YouTube to be a responsible platform that allowed people to show their talent and get their talent out to the world, but not to be harmful. And so YouTube took tremendous steps while I was at the company to show that it was a responsible platform and was not undermining democracy, but strengthening democracy.
Absolutely. And I know that's very relevant now as YouTube remains one of the only independent news sources available in Russia, I believe. YouTube is still on.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And these are not easy debates. Zelensky needs the internet. He needs it to be able to communicate with us. He needed to be able to communicate with the Congress this morning. The people who are fighting for democracy, not only in Ukraine, but in other parts of the world, need our communication tools. When I was at Google, and I'm not speaking too much out of school here, but when the coup happened in February 2021, we had to figure out what do we do so that the activists who are trying to preserve democracy can still communicate with each other, and that our tools won't be used to figure out who is fighting for democracy and throw them in jail. And I won't tell you exactly what we did, but we found technologies that we smuggled over the border that helped keep the activists safe. And we smuggled them right under the noses of the generals. And I was proud to be part of that effort because we were keeping hope alive.
Wow, that's great. Question from Chris, who would like to know more about your current role. Specifically, he asks, can you discuss more specifically what positive impacts you are having in your current role in this public-private partnership role?
Thank you. So ASEAN ASEAN includes 667 million people. It is it's 10 countries, fast growing region, fastest growing internet economy on the planet. It will soon be the fourth largest economy on earth collectively. And there's a lot of interest in the United States, but it's 10 countries and there's no Brussels. There's no kind of central organizing principle. There's this organization in Jakarta called ASEAN, but that isn't really what the region is about. The region is about these 10 wildly diverse countries, from tiny, wealthy Singapore to Myanmar, which is getting poorer every day. And our job, I think, is often to serve as interpreter, to help American businesses understand the complexity of Southeast Asia and help the Southeast Asian nations achieve their aspirations. Because in cases of many, they want to take advantage of the opportunities of the global economy. And three areas are, just to use as examples, where there's huge energy, huge amount of private sector energy, are around sustainability. All of the ASEAN nations are looking at how can we do this energy transition? How can we move to economic foundations that are more sustainable? The internet economy, how can we take advantage of this really rapid growth in the internet economy so that our people will be able to achieve their aspirations? And then health and life sciences. How do we keep people who have survived the pandemic, how do we keep them healthy? How do we get vaccines to the people who need them, life-saving medicines to the people who need them? How do we make sure that even in the poorest countries of Southeast Asia, there's access to decent health care? These are matters in which our companies, the 178 companies that are part of the US-ASEAN Business Council, are engaged. And what we're able to do is we understand ASEAN. So we're able to help them understand the context in which they're doing business. And we're helping the ASEAN partners understand what it is that our companies are trying to do. And I've just returned a couple days ago from Vietnam. We did the first face-to-face set of meetings that we've done since COVID. And it was powerful because I'd brought 40 companies. We met with all the top leadership. They were so glad that we showed up. They were so ready to emerge from this pandemic. And I just, deals were done. We've got movement in the right direction on an open and free internet. We were able to accomplish so much by bringing people together. It's about relationships and showing respect.
Wonderful. We'll take one more question for this part, and then we'll move on to our final part about dealing across cultures. So our final question here is from Fong. Among the most vulnerable regions to climate change, Southeast Asia is undergoing an epidemiological transition due to expanding breeding grounds for disease vectors. How do you see your role within this public-private sector advance global health efforts in the climate crisis era?
Thank you. So I spent a lot of time on this when I was in government. I realized that one of the ways that we could bring countries together was by working on non-political challenges. And this started with SARS. For me, it started with SARS and HIV/AIDS, because in the cases of both of those diseases, we could do so much more if the United States invested and if we were sharing information. And so we brought the CDC to Southeast Asia, and they've never looked back. It's in the interest of the American people, because a lot of these diseases kind of brew up overseas and then they come and they hit the American people. If you can understand what's happening on the ground, you can take better public health efforts to deal with it. So by the time I left Vietnam, for example, we had emergency operations centers in North, South, and Center, exchanging real-time data about infectious disease transmission with epidemiologists in Atlanta, every day, all the time. And that, when COVID hit, that was so useful. So that's on the government to government level. And now because that cooperation has been so good, now the regional center for CDC has been established in Hanoi. When Vice President Kamala Harris went to Hanoi, she opened that regional center. But what I'm finding with our companies is they all want to help. And so when it came to COVID, we had FedEx and UPS flying in personal protective equipment, helping get vaccines where they needed to be. We had companies lining up to help. We were able to ship PPE from New York City to Jakarta when the Indonesians were being hit hardest. And then our health and life sciences companies are all looking at ways that they can make sure that their services are available to those who need them. One of the companies, Organon, deals with women's health. And in Vietnam, they're making tremendous strides. In Indonesia, they're making tremendous strides. So my view is this is an area where a public-private partnership really works. When governments can set up the right environment and have the right policies, companies will come in and fill the gaps. And that's what we try to do at the council.
That's great, great. And on to our final part today. I think you were called the bicycle diplomat during your service in Vietnam. Yes. Is that right? Yes. And yes. I think you were very well known and beloved for really making connections with people and sharing American culture, but also really respecting Vietnamese culture and bridging both sides very effectively. So would love to hear about your views on what it takes to be successful operating across cultures, maybe starting at the individual level. What can people do to be more successful? And then what can organizations do?
Thank you. Well, you used the critical word, which is respect. I rode my bicycle from one end of Vietnam to the other because I like riding bikes and I wanted to learn about Vietnam. And when I was first there in the mid-90s, that was the speed, that was kind of the prevailing speed. Everyone rode bicycles. It was before there were so many motorbikes and cars. But I used that trip to learn a lot about the country. And to me, you're biking, you're not flying over in an airplane, you're not going by in a limousine, you're talking to people. And I speak Vietnamese. And so every day I'd be talking to people and learning about their lives and learning about the rice cycles and seeing this country that was just emerging from the worst poverty. It was one of the poorest countries in Asia at that time, and it's not anymore. And then so when I went back as ambassador, I thought, well, I still like biking. If I'm just in a limousine or passing through, then I won't get to learn what's happening in the country. So I'm going to keep biking because I love to bike. But it turns out that also conveyed what I wanted to convey, which is respect. I am deeply interested in the language, the people, the culture of Vietnam. And whenever I would do something that kind of celebrated Vietnamese culture or something in Vietnam's history, it would get an enormous response. And I was very active on social media. So I was hearing directly from people every day from all over the country. I was getting over the heads of the leaders and right to people. And when I did something that showed respect, whether during Tet, for example, the New Year's celebration, that's like New Year's and Easter and Halloween all rolled into one. It's a really important holiday in Vietnam. And so when I went with my family, not a traditional family, my husband is Black, our children are Mexican American, but when we went to follow a tradition and put release carp into West Lake in Hanoi near a pagoda, people loved that. And when we made bánh chông, which is the traditional food that you eat, or when we took the peach blossoms into our home, these showed respect. So I think that's what it boils down to. It's respect and knowledge. Because if you can learn about the language and the history and the culture of a country, then you can really show that respect. And for me, it was easy because I felt it. It was real. I respect not only what Vietnam has gone through, but what it's doing now and the industriousness of its people. And if you can show that respect, doors are wide open. And then, partnership is possible, friendship is possible. And this is what, I feel like this is a core lesson of diplomacy. Those who say it's just about power and money don't get this. It is about respect and relationships and knowledge.
I'm curious what role your fluency in Vietnamese played in all of this. Did you find it opened a lot of doors, or what do you think about that?
Absolutely. I was sometimes referred to as the biking ambassador because people knew I biked. I was sometimes referred, I suppose I was referred to as the gay ambassador because I was only the second career person to do that. But more than that, I was referred to as the ambassador who spoke Vietnamese. So I would go to these really remote provinces, and people would come out and say, "Oh, I've heard about you. You're the ambassador who speaks Vietnamese." And they were surprised. It's a hard language. It's tonal. Pronunciation is really tough. It's mostly, it's pretty staccato. It's one syllable words or compound words, two syllables joined together. But all of the variation is subtle, and it's in pronunciation or in tone. And I remember when I first was learning, I thought, oh my God, this is impossible. There's no way I'll be able to use this language. But once I was able to use it, the doors opened wide everywhere. And it made all the difference in the world. And I was the first Vietnamese speaking US ambassador. And that made a huge difference. I'm really happy to say that the 8th ambassador, not my immediate successor, but the ambassador who's there now, also speaks Vietnamese. And like me, he spent time as a younger diplomat. It's harder to learn a language when you're in your 50s. It's much easier in your 20s or 30s. He learned also when he was younger, and he speaks Vietnamese well. And I'll tell you, it just makes all the difference in the world. I don't think it's just in diplomacy. I think in business, you show respect by learning a tough language, doors will fling open.
That's great. Well, we welcome more questions. I think we'll have time for maybe a couple more. And we do have one from Kevin, who's asking, what are some misconceptions about Vietnam and the broader region ASEAN that are outdated now, especially with respect to doing business in the region as Americans?
So I think there are some images of Vietnam in particular that are way out of date. When Barack Obama came to Vietnam, people were kind of surprised. We set up a meeting so that he could meet young people in Ho Chi Minh City, and a young woman stood up and started rapping. She said she was a rapper, and he said, "Badoom, badoom, can I give you a beat? Give me some rap." And she started rapping, and that image went viral. Why did it go viral? Because it was so contrary to expectations. I think a lot of people thought, well, it's a communist country. People are going to be wearing baggy olive green clothes. And she was this hip, young woman rapper, defying all expectations. Vietnam is in the modern age. Its young people are switched on, they're connected, they know what's going on in the world. The internet has changed their lives so much. Prosperity has helped too. They're way more prosperous now than they were when I was first there. But they're connected to the world. And I think you see that throughout Southeast Asia. Indonesians are very connected to the world. And there's a lot of misunderstandings about Indonesia. It's the world's 4th largest nation. It's the largest Muslim majority nation. It's the 3rd largest democracy on earth. It is a happening place, multi-ethnic, multi-religious. It's a functioning democracy. Who would think that island nation, 17,000 islands, all of these different languages and ethnicities and religions, would be Southeast Asia's most highly functioning democracy. There are older democracies. The Philippines is an older democracy, but I'm telling you, Indonesia's democracy is way healthier than any other democracy in Southeast Asia. And we don't necessarily look at it as a model, but it is. We ignore what's happening in Indonesia at our peril, and especially, given the fact that we have such challenges in the Muslim world. But in Indonesia, we're respected, we're liked, we have a good, strong relationship. And then when it comes to doing business, I think most of the misconceptions just come from lack of knowledge, lack of understanding of the changes that are taking place in Southeast Asia that I think are profound, including its deepening connection to the world through the internet.
Great. Good. We have one final question before we wrap up here today, and it's from Mike, who says, I've been working in Vietnam for the last 8 years and think highly of the people in the country. What lessons can we learn from the US-Vietnamese reconciliation to other long conflicts taking place in places like the Middle East?
No, I really appreciate that question. I am more knowledgeable about Vietnam than I am about a place like Afghanistan or even about the Middle East. I speak some Arabic, I've spent some time in the Middle East, but I don't pretend to have deep knowledge. And I think it's important to understand the context in which changes are taking place. But I do believe there are some lessons that are universal. I believe when you take the time to understand a culture well, to immerse yourself in its language and its history, you have a much better chance making good decisions. We learned that in Vietnam. We didn't understand Vietnam very well, and I think that's where we made a lot of the mistakes we made in the 60s and 70s. In Afghanistan, I think if we understood the country a lot better, we would have made fewer mistakes. I also think one of the lessons of reconciliation is that it will be the people of a nation who decide its future, not an outsider. And we learned that in Vietnam, and we learned that in Afghanistan, and I wish Putin understood that, because it won't be he who decides Ukraine's future. The small nations can, over time, wear down larger nations. The Vietnamese showed us that. The Afghans have shown us that. The Vietnamese showed it again and again. They fought China 22 times. They fought the United States. They fought France. They fought Cambodia. They prevailed because their leaders were able to appeal to something that's still fundamental in human nature, which is nationalism. And those who think they can come in from the outside and change the future of a country have really got an uphill task.
Wow, that's a great message to end on, Ambassador. Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights, the importance in respecting and understanding cultures and speaking languages, in succeeding both in business and in diplomacy. So many lessons here, and we really value the time we spent with you. So thank you, and take care.
My great pleasure. Thanks to everybody for joining this conversation. Thank you for some wonderful questions.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.